It just took a couple minutes. All righty then, let's go live. All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first talk in our 2021-2022 speaker series for the Center for Criminological Research. We're very lucky this morning to have Kanika Samuels from Carleton University, and I'll introduce her in just a second here. Before I do that, though, I just want to encourage everyone, to check out all the great content that we have on our YouTube channel and our podcast. You can find our podcast on any podcast platform. It's on crime and punishment. And, we had a great summer series on COVID in Canadian prisons that went on. All our talks from last year are on our YouTube channel, the conference we did last year, and some nice kind of intros to all of the kind of main faculty members are rolling out on our YouTube channel. So, do please go and check those out and, subscribe to our channel and the podcast. It'll be well worth your time. Okay, so today, as I said, we have Dr. Kanika Samuels from the Carleton University in Ottawa. And Dr. Samuels-Wortley's areas of interest include race and racism, youth, delinquency, policing, corrections, and critical race theory. Her research explores the complex relationship between race and crime and is committed to better understand the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous youth in the criminal justice system. Her research aims to advance critical race discourse in Canada through empirical mixed method approaches. Her current study incorporates both quantitative and qualitative methods to explore how perceptions and experiences with racial discrimination by law enforcement officials may contribute to victimization and offending among Black and Indigenous youth. All right, and I will hand it over to you. We're very much looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff, so much for that introduction. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you all from my home, which is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations. And it's the traditional home to the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabeg peoples. As a Black Canadian, I recognize that I am a beneficiary of colonialism, but as a descendant of enslaved African peoples, I stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities. I acknowledge that as a non-Indigenous person, I am in a privileged position as a researcher when speaking on Indigenous issues. Therefore, I'm always open to hearing feedback from Indigenous peoples on how my research findings may impact their communities. I also wanted to thank Dr. Sandra Basarius, as well as the organizers, for the invitation to speak with you all today. So my research, like mentioned, centers the perceptions of and experiences with the police among Black, Indigenous, and white youth in Canada. Today, I'll be discussing how perceptions of racial discrimination within policing may impede reporting violent victimization to law enforcement officials. So discussing race and racism is often a very controversial and emotional issue, as we as Canadians view diversity as our strength, and we see ourselves as a nation that is more racially tolerant than our neighbor to the south. Thus, we tend to believe that we have escaped the ills of racism that has contributed to tense relations between racialized peoples and law enforcement. The truth, however, is that exploring the impact of racial discrimination with respect to policing is not an easy task in our country. This is greatly influenced by historical, formal, and informal bans on the collection of race-based data. Therefore, research exploring the intersection of race, racism, and the functionality of Canadian policing is limited. I aim to add to race and crime scholarship in Canada, including crime reporting literature. According to recent StatsCan data, most incidents of crime were not reported to the police. This is problematic as law enforcement officials rely on citizens to report criminal activity. Therefore, exploring why citizens fail to report is an important area of study. If law enforcement agencies do not know the nature of criminal activity within communities, this impedes their ability to implement relevant crime prevention and intervention strategies. So research demonstrates that Black and Indigenous peoples are at a higher risk of experiencing violent victimization. And as such, having a better understanding of their motivation to report to the police should be an area of focus. So for today's presentation, I will start off with a brief discussion of the crime reporting literature and the relevance of exploring perceptions of racially biased policing. I will follow with a discussion on how the historical oppression of Black and Indigenous peoples in Canada may increase violent victimization for youth within these communities. This also aims to demonstrate that when exploring crime reporting among citizens, having a better understanding of the effects of both colonialism and enslavement may provide insights as to why Indigenous and Black peoples in particular may be less likely to report to legal authorities. I will then go into my study questions and review my methodology and findings. Implications of these findings will conclude this presentation. So various studies have explored factors that predict crime reporting. To illustrate, some studies have found that women are less likely to report their victimization to the police in comparison to men. However, other studies have found that women are more likely to report. Similarly, some studies have found that those who are educated and employed are more likely to report their experiences with violent victimization, while other studies have found no relationship between social class and reporting. However, what is consistent is that young people are less likely to report their victimization to law enforcement officials. Also, studies exploring race often demonstrate that racialized peoples are less likely to report their victimization to the police. So knowing these factors are important. However, in a systematic review of the literature, Sia and Baumer highlight that very few studies thoroughly examine contextual dynamics that may influence a citizen's decision to report. So while a number of studies have suggested race as a factor in reporting, few have explored why race matters. One factor may be lack of confidence in the police. So policing researchers suggest those with negative perceptions of law enforcement are less likely to report crimes and cooperate with police investigations. International studies in the US, UK, and Australia have firmly established that racialized communities are more likely to report negative perceptions of the police. A growing number of Canadian studies suggest that Black and Indigenous peoples report lower confidence in the police and more likely to report that the police are racially biased. So following this logic, race may be a salient factor to explore when it comes to reporting victimization to law enforcement officials in Canada. So while some studies do acknowledge race when discussing underreporting, few thoroughly examine how perceptions of racial discrimination within policing may be a significant deterrent. So research consistently demonstrates that members from Indigenous and Black communities are overrepresented in Canadian crime victimization data. For example, in comparison to their white and other racialized counterparts, Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in violent victimization statistics, including homicide. In fact, Indigenous women in particular consistently report higher rates of violent victimization, including intimate partner violence. And Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be killed by an intimate partner than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Scholars link these experiences to Canada's colonialist foundation, which has produced intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma has contributed to contemporary social and economic disadvantages for Indigenous peoples. As we all know, social and economic disadvantage strongly predict both victimization and offending. So research also suggests that the historical oppression of enslavement has indeed played a direct role in the present social conditions of Black people in Canada by facilitating spatial segregation, economic disadvantage, and social exclusion. So while data exploring violent victimization in Black communities is limited, the overrepresentation of Black peoples in areas of poverty in Canada suggests that they too are at an increased risk of being a victim of a crime. But in addition to higher rates of interpersonal victimization, scholars have long argued that Black and Indigenous people are further victimized by the criminal justice system. So for decades, researchers and activists have raised concerns over racially biased policing, resulting in both the oversurveillance and underpolicing in Black and Indigenous communities. In 1995, the Commission on Systemic Racism in the Ontario Justice System found that Black peoples were more likely to be apprehended by the police. Police were more likely to draw their weapons when apprehending a racialized suspect for minor crimes. And finally, Black men reported being unfairly stopped and questioned by the police in comparison to their white counterparts. In the same year, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples highlighted numerous studies that demonstrated Indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in Canadian correctional facilities. Racial bias in policing was often cited as one cause of this overrepresentation. Indigenous people consistently reported that they believe the police are unfair and thus ineffective. Furthermore, study participants suggested that police officers held negative stereotypical attitudes towards Indigenous peoples, which resulted in higher arrest rates for minor offenses in comparison to non-Indigenous peoples. And decades later, as you'll see, similar commission reports suggest that little has changed. So there is a growing consensus that perceptions of racial bias within policing is reason for concern. My study aims to explore whether perceptions of racial bias in policing may in turn impact young people's willingness to report their own experiences with victimization to law enforcement officials. As noted, Canadian data suggests Indigenous and Black peoples are more likely to experience personal violent victimization. Thus, they are increasingly vulnerable in Canadian society. So my research questions are as follows. 1, does race impact youth's willingness to report violent victimization to the police? And 2, how do perceptions of the police impact youth's willingness to report violent victimization to law enforcement officials? So the focus of the current study, which I'll be discussing with you, is of youth residing in the City of Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area in the province of Ontario. The location is of significance as data suggests that of all Canadian provinces, Ontario has the lowest rate of reporting victimization to the police. This coincides with the fact that Ontario also has the largest Black and Indigenous population in Canada. More than half of the total Black population in Canada reside in Ontario. And similarly, almost a quarter of all Indigenous peoples are in Ontario. So my focus is on the youth population. Exploring a youth population is particularly important as national data suggests that young Canadians between the ages of 15 and 24 are more likely to experience victimization. The data to be discussed stems from a larger project which explores perceptions of police among a racially diverse sample of 34 Black, Indigenous, and white youth. However, today's presentation will explore in-depth, semi-structured interviews with 19 young Black and Indigenous peoples who indicate that they have had direct contact with the police. I must note that I conducted interviews between February 2019 and March 2020. So while my initial intent was to include more Indigenous participants, due to COVID-19 restrictions, I was not able to conduct additional interviews. But I do wish to include the voices of those who did share their stories with me. So all youth in the study were asked questions about their overall impression of the police. They were then asked whether their impression of the police would have an impact on reporting a hypothetical act of personal victimization. More specifically, each youth participant was asked the following. So now thinking about how you view police, if you were ever the victim of a violent crime, like a stabbing, a shooting, or a robbery, would you report it to the police? It was at this time that some Black and Indigenous youth provided lived experiences in which they did or did not report their victimization to the police. And it is these responses that provide context to my second research question: how perceptions of the police impact a youth's willingness to report victimization to law enforcement officials. The focus of the current study is to explore those narratives who state that they would not or are hesitant to report violent victimization to the police. So to answer research question 1, whether there are any racial differences with respect to youth's willingness to report violent victimization to the police, the results suggest that there are clear differences. As the table here suggests, the sample of white youth are significantly more likely to report personal victimization to law enforcement officials in comparison to their Black and Indigenous counterparts. But caution should be taken in regard to the Indigenous youth percentage. As noted, 75% of Indigenous youth state that they would not report their victimization to the police. However, this is based on a small sample. But regardless, it is important to note and explore the greater proportion of Indigenous youth who would not report their victimization. Similarly, it's also important to explore the proportion of youth who state that they may report their victimization to the police. So as you see, the number of Black and white youth is similar. However, exploring their responses as to why provides insight into the factors that may affect a youth's motivation to report. So the narratives of Black and Indigenous youth suggest that perceptions of racial bias within policing impacts their motivation to report experiences with violent victimization. They are less likely to report due to their extreme mistrust in law enforcement. Findings suggest that as a result of lived experience, Black and Indigenous youth, 1, believe that the police will turn a youth's victimization into an opportunity to criminalize them. 2, the police may engage in violence during an interaction and in turn harm the youth. And 3, as opposed to the police, family or community members are better suited to handle personal victimization. So a common sentiment among both Black and Indigenous youth is a concern that if victimized, calling the police will lead to an investigation into the youth's own behavior. There is a sense that the police will show little compassion. Of the 3 Indigenous youth who would not report to the police, 2 express fear that previous documented contact with the police would influence an officer's behavior and thus may lead to a subsequent charge. Similarly, of the 6 Black youth who state that they would not report their victimization to the police, 4 indicate they fear previous run-ins with the police will influence that officer's behavior. Youth would express feelings of being targeted by the police, believing it was an effort to criminalize them. So for some Black youth, they perceived the police to be untrustworthy and felt law enforcement officials did little to establish positive relationships. Instead, they perceived that law enforcement officials arrest and detain people from their community. So to illustrate further, Andrea, a young Black woman, states this: I think the police represent protection for a certain type of people. I think the police are necessary, but it wasn't created to make sure people like me are safe and meant more to put people like me in jails. When I was younger, I would have to call the police a lot because I didn't feel safe. And I would just watch the police treat me and my family like criminals when we were the victims. Andrea did not expand on her experiences with victimization or why she had to call police, but she made it clear that she felt the police were more concerned about finding any wrongdoing amongst the family as opposed to showing any concern for their safety. Similar sentiments are expressed by Indigenous participants. In response to whether they would call the police if victimized, Jesse states that he would, but expresses some hesitation. They state, some Native people have been through bad times, but police just seem to expect it when they come and they don't care. All they see is alcoholics, drug addicts, and a whole bunch of other things. So that's the only outlook they have. And that's what they think of most. That's what they think of most of us. I know Natives have had some problems, but police don't see the good ones. They just focus on the bad and think that we're all the same. So here, Jesse expresses concern over law enforcement officials' negative perceptions of Indigenous communities, and thus fears that they do not care about people within these communities and only focus on the bad. For some Black and Indigenous youth, their words demonstrate that law enforcement officials aid in criminalizing peoples from their communities, and thus fail to provide proper protection from victimization. Thus, for some, their failure to report violent victimization to the police is related to the perception that they will not be taken seriously, but instead face scrutiny and potential criminalization. So a troubling trend expressed by some Black and Indigenous youth involve the potential to be victimized by the police themselves. To illustrate, Troy, a young 20-year-old Black man, recalls an incident in which the police raided his home. He was suspicious of the timing of the raid as the next day he was to attend court to have charges dropped for a previous incident. Troy did not go into this incident. He explained that the police burst into his home and violently apprehended both he and his mother. Troy explained that the officers in attendance, and I quote, got my mother on the floor, stepped on her neck, and gun butt me. Troy says he recalls the officer looked over at Troy as his mother was laying on the floor and smiled. Troy was upset by the officer's demeanor and called the officer a choice name. At this point, another officer hit Troy with the butt of their gun for the second time. On that day, Troy was charged for assaulting a police officer. Troy spoke of harassment by the police since the age of 9, in which he was accused of selling marijuana. From his experiences, he believes the police, and I quote, make stuff worse and simply harass Black kids. Thus, when asked if he would call the police if the victim of a violent crime, Troy gave a resounding no. He continued to state that the police just fuck up your life and don't even care, so I don't fuck with them. Several Black youth note psychological taunts or threats in their encounters with the police, including Chris, a 16-year-old youth who recalls a time he was arrested for an assault charge. He states, I'm sitting in the back of the police car, quiet. I don't want to say anything. There were 2 police officers and they drove me to my uncle's house. One of them was like, oh, this guy's too quiet. He's no fun. And kept saying stuff like that. When we got to my uncle's house, one officer went to the door to talk to my uncle. And then the other officer turns to me and is like, oh, if I was your uncle, I would beat the shit out of you. For Chris, this encounter had a significant influence on how he viewed the police. He did not see them as an authority figure that would listen to him when in need. Instead, Chris felt his victimization, as he too was assaulted in the incident that he was apprehended for, was minimized while the police threatened to harm him. Similarly, Jared, an 18-year-old Indigenous youth, recalled a stop and search encounter where an officer frequently referred to him as, and I quote, an Indian, and continuously asked Jared if he were drunk. So when speaking of her encounter with the law enforcement, another youth, Lisa, an 18-year-old Black youth, expressed a belief that most Black people must learn to navigate police taunts, as in her opinion, law enforcement officials only see Black people as criminals. Lisa states, and I quote, I refuse to internalize any of the bullshit that they say. Therefore, it is not surprising that the majority of Black and Indigenous youth state that they would not, or express hesitation to, report violent victimization to the police. Instead, some youth express seeking alternative solutions. So a common sentiment by both Black and Indigenous youth who state they would not or were hesitant to report their victimization to law enforcement officials believe community or family members are better suited to address their victimization. To illustrate, 50% of Black youth and 100% of Indigenous youth who stated that they would not report to the police expressed that they would report to either a community or family member. So when I asked Nathan, a young Indigenous man, whether he would report to the police if he were the victim of a violent crime, he revealed he in fact was stabbed and did not report the incident. He shared that he sought help from his father and uncle who were in a gang. Nathan knew his family would deal with the incident and was not confident that reporting his stabbing to the police would have resulted in a better outcome. Nathan did not go into much detail about the incident, but was adamant that the police are not necessary if one has the support of a gang family. So when I asked Terry, a 24-year-old Black man, whether he would report violent victimization to the police, Terry confidently stated no. He explains, I feel that my community would deal with it. Growing up, I would always hear from older guys, older family members. If you have an issue, you let them know. So knowing that I was never instructed to call the police, I never grew up into that habit. If I ever had an issue, which was pretty rare, I'd call my boys. So if I was a victim, even now, I mean, even though I have an education and I'm a professional, it's been ingrained in me that I'm not calling the police. Terry reveals that he was socialized to view family and community members as an alternative to the police when in need. As a result of deep-seated beliefs that the police are biased and thus do not care for members of the Black community. This supports the assertion that negative attitudes towards the police can have a significant influence on reporting violent victimization. As for the young Black women in my study, interestingly, not one stated that they would not report their victimization to the police. Most stated that they would or would be hesitant. However, all provided further insight, and their narrative suggests that they do not believe law enforcement officials are the best solution. So to illustrate, Keisha states, there's ways we can resolve things, especially people who are in the community and are used to seeing certain violence, and it won't turn them off. They'll know how to de-escalate. Police are necessary, but kind of like a last-minute resort, because the police don't really do shit. Another young woman was quite reflective on this question. While she did not explicitly state that her community or family were better suited to deal with her victimization, she recalls needing to call the police on numerous occasions due to an abusive partner who had mental health issues. However, Gabrielle states that she never truly felt that the police were helpful. She in fact expresses, and I quote, "I wish there was somebody that I could call, like a mental health nurse, because they would be able to do something way more than an officer." Gabrielle also shared that she often factored in her ex-partner's race before calling the police. She recalls a particular incident in which a bystander called the police. She states, "Me and my ex were in an argument and we were outside and he was threatening to harm himself. He was not supposed to be around me and I had charges against him. So I'm trying to navigate getting help without ruining someone else's life. My ex was born in Jamaica. He's already a target for the police. He had no record before this. I weighed all of those things, but I needed to be safe. It's really difficult because there's so many people who will not take that step, thinking about the fact that justice is not going to be applied in a fair way." And that was really difficult to navigate. So while Gabrielle does not specifically look to family or community members as an alternative to the police, her narrative suggests that she does not have confidence in law enforcement and believes mental health professionals are better suited to handle victimization incidents. Gabrielle's sentiments reflect growing calls to explore alternative measures and invest in crime intervention strategies that do not involve law enforcement. So overall, the narrative suggests that Black and Indigenous youth perceptions of racial bias within policing may result in a failure to report their own experiences with violent victimization to law enforcement officials. In other words, these youth question the legitimacy of the police as they believe racial discrimination within policing impedes their officers' ability to assist when in need. In summary, the findings suggest that due to perceived racial bias and negative experiences with the police, Black and Indigenous youth are less motivated to report their experiences with violent victimization to law enforcement officials. Furthermore, the suggestion that some youth may turn to members within their community to address violent victimization could ultimately increase violence in these communities and reduce overall community safety. So stories of select Black and Indigenous youth suggest that police services need to examine how their own encounters with racialized youth, as it can ultimately damage their ability to solve crime, as well as keep individuals and communities safe. Therefore, police institutions need to reevaluate their role in racialized communities and acknowledge the behaviors that alienate youth. In essence, this distrust in the police may be putting members of racialized communities at an increased risk of victimization as a result of engaging in alternative strategies. Furthermore, without an accurate picture of violent criminal activity, law enforcement officials are not able to effectively assist those who are in need. So the limitations of this study is that these findings cannot be generalized to the experiences of all Black, Indigenous, and white people in Toronto and the GTA. As the sample is derived from a major urban Canadian area, rural location may yield different experiences with law enforcement. Furthermore, I do not explore other identified contextual factors which may also influence a youth's willingness to report their victimization to the police, like engagement in criminality, the victim-offender relationship, or fear of retaliation. However, the results do demonstrate that perceptions of racial bias in policing is reason for concern. And finally, a quantitative component would be beneficial. This may demonstrate disparities in reporting practices among Black and Indigenous youth, which can then lead insight into the wider impacts of negative police perceptions. So that's the end of my presentation, and I thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Samuels. All right, so anybody who wants to ask a question, if you're in the Zoom chat, you can just turn your microphone on if you don't mind, or type it into the chat box and I will read it out. If you are watching on YouTube, you're about 30 seconds behind. But yeah, feel free to type into the chat and I will relay the question over to Dr. Samuels here.
Can I go?
Yeah, go for it, Kevin.
I guess I have a two-part question. You can hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So a two-part question. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't get a sense of who these kids were. So that's the first part. Like, where were they drawn from? What background experiences? I got the sense from what your discussion that they seemed disproportionately to be kind of criminally involved, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, that unfortunately I didn't have the opportunity to go into a deeper dive of the sample. But as the table suggests, I interviewed youth from a youth shelter, as well as an after-school program. And I also managed to get one youth from a legal clinic in the Toronto area. So some of the youth were criminally involved, but I would actually have to say the majority were not. So those who shared that they would not contact police if victimized, overwhelmingly, there were a few that had contact with police as a result of an incident that involved a crime, but the majority were not, and felt that their previous experiences with police, whether it might be within the schools or something that they had viewed outside of the school, had a significant impact on whether they would report to the police.
So that was the first part of the question, which was useful. Thank you. But the second part then is, and I realize you pointed this out as a limitation in your study, but you did talk to these folks. And I just wondered, did they talk about the cultural dynamics around snitching, which are now a mainstream kind of thing? These are not this is not a subcultural norm anymore. So did this come up as something that they mentioned?
Yeah, and that was actually something I honestly was looking out for, and it didn't come up. So the argument that I, in essence, am trying to make, that we're aware of the culture of snitching. However, there might really be a significant impact on the way that youth have had experienced the police, and in essence may have a significant impact then on the way that they navigate their own communities. So while snitching may have a significant impact, I think, on those who are more criminally involved, for those who are not, I think that there is certainly a utility in exploring how negative perceptions and the perception that police are racially biased has a significant impact on their motivation to report to police.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
All right, anybody else?
I go. That gives you more time to read questions from the chat. Kanika, I know this is super hypothetical, but what do you think would be the results if you did the study elsewhere in Canada? Like, what's the sort of like Ontario impact here?
That's a great question. So that was raised as a limitation where I am talking to youth who are situated in an urban center. So we also know that those who reside in urban centers are more likely to have negative experiences with the police. So there might be utility in examining the experiences of youth who reside in rural areas, as there might be a closer relationship to those who are policing these areas. And as a result, they may feel more comfortable sharing their experiences of victimization with police, or may not. That's something that certainly should be explored. But I certainly note that where I gathered the sample could have an impact then on perceptions of racial bias, and also on negative perceptions of youth. In terms of looking at different areas in Canada, I would argue that there wouldn't be much of a change. And I say this because the broader project is a mixed method project, which also examines quantitative methods, which is where I'm looking at StatsCan data, where I look at perceptions of the police among youth in all of Canada. And this data demonstrates that Black and Indigenous youth are more likely to report negative perceptions of the police, more likely to have lower confidence in the police. So I suspect that if I were to drop into, another area in Canada, whether that be in the West or in the East or another area in Central Canada, I might get very similar responses. But definitely demonstrates that more quantitative work should look into this. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. So one from L'Oreal. Okay, so she says, such interesting and important research, Dr. Samuels Wortley. I'm wondering, what do you mean when you say that police institutions need to reevaluate their own role in racialized communities? Or said differently, based on your impressions from your participants, what do you think these reevaluated roles might look like?
Certainly. Thank you very much for that question. So I will note that I had these interviews with youth prior to our global discussions on re-examining the role of police in society and a movement for abolishing the police. And I would ask every single youth at the end of my interview, what is it that I should tell police, or what suggestions should I make if I were to tell them what it is they need to do to help bridge the gap between yourselves and those who are within policing. And every single one just indicated they wish that officers would be more respectful when engaging with youth in their communities. So what that looks like, I think, is to not have the idea and perception that police are only there to arrest, detain, and criminalize members of their community. There really needs to be more of a concerted effort to build a level of community engagement. And this idea of community policing has often been pushed within policing for decades, but it doesn't seem to be working. I think what the concerns are is that, there's certain officers that are designated to to engage in community policing, but that really should be a mentality for all. And so where that needs to stem from is right from training, where there needs to be more insight into how you can positively engage with the community members that you serve. So when I speak to examining the role of police in racialized communities, it is speaking to that being very cognizant that there are historical tensions and between policing and racialized communities in Canada. And as a result, there really needs to be made a concerted effort to change what policing looks like for particular communities, and that is racialized communities in Canada. So when I say that we need to re-examine the role, there really needs to be more of a focus on what policing means for Black and Indigenous peoples in this country.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, I've got a question here from Christina. Christine here from Question. What do you suggest that the police in the GTA, in terms of what they should do or say in order to create trust in those certain communities? Also, do you feel like this study would also apply to racialized immigrant spaces and participants? Do you think their response would be similar as to what was seen in your research?
Excellent question. Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to tackle the first one. What do police need to do or say? I think it's past doing or saying anything. I think at this point, this needs to come from the top, where policing really needs to focus on what their officers are, how they're being trained, and what they're learning right from the beginning. So it isn't anything that, they can't be given a script as to when they go into a certain community, what they need to say. There really needs to be ingrained within the officers that we have protecting these communities, that there is a genuine effort to protect these communities, and thus have a better understanding as to the historical impacts of our colonialist past, which is still part of our present, as well as the legacy of enslavement. That the policing was very much involved during this time. So there needs to be a recognition of that, a recognition of the historical impacts of what law enforcement has meant for racialized communities in Canada. So now when you're looking at how to navigate racialized communities, it's important to understand this and change the mentality of what policing is right from the beginning. I hope that answers that question. As for the second one, which is, may this be different with immigrant communities, I believe. That's a great question, and I'm not sure. So where I would have a little hesitation with that is, previous Canadian research has demonstrated that those who come to our country actually have more positive perceptions of the police and of Canadian policing. And this is because of negative experiences that they may have had with policing in their countries. So, you know, if you get someone who comes to our country from the get-go, there might be very different perceptions. But the research demonstrates that when an individual is here longer and they have had an experience with a police officer, that perception of policing changes. It no longer is positive, it then becomes negative. So we then have to recognize, again, this is due to engagement with police as individuals are navigating their communities. So that's an interesting question, and that is absolutely one that should be explored. And I think it is important then to have an understanding as to when these questions would be asked, if it would be right when an individual has come into our country, and after how long perhaps those perceptions may change.
Okay, perfect. And I believe Dr. Compo, you had a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Kanika. That was awesome. Okay, I have a question about the broader literature, particularly as it relates to the US, and maybe how you might be thinking about that literature. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of large scale quantitative studies using neighborhood level data sets or even macro level longitudinal designs. And this is mostly in major US cities. And they're finding what the literature is calling a paradox of sorts, right? So that cynicism and negative perceptions is high about policing in predominantly African-American neighborhoods, but the data suggests residents persist in calling the police, right? And what they're finding is that racial composition is actually quite linked to police reporting. Mm-hmm. So how are you thinking about your findings, which are suggesting something different, right? Mm-hmm. In light of these findings, and is it possible that what you're highlighting is more closely aligned with a youth effect rather than a race effect given these findings? Or is it that we've got the US and we've got Canada?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that question. So I will refer back to my data where I outlined that for Black women, most of them indicated that they would still call the police, but there was hesitation in calling the police. So of course, there are different responses when it comes to the quantitative data when we're looking at the US context. And this is where I make the argument that it is important to include qualitative data into understanding those numbers. So, we're seeing a difference in where some communities where you will see racial bias has an impact on reporting to the police, and then others where it doesn't seem to have an impact. That's why we need to get down to the stories and the experiences to have a better understanding. So once again, if I refer to the women in my study, they experienced negative experiences with the police, but they felt there wasn't anyone else that they could call. So I think maybe right there, we should start looking at an intersectional approach and looking at both race and gender. So maybe Black women don't seem to feel that they have anyone else to call other than the police, and you know, just the tricky relationship between the two. So I certainly appreciate that the US data is demonstrating that, but I think it is important for us to look as well at the Canadian context, and specifically looking at youth. Most studies that do look at crime reporting really tend to only focus on adult populations, but it's very important for us to look at youth populations because, as demonstrated, youth are more likely to experience violent victimization in this country. Therefore, we need to have better insight into what is it that they do when they are being victimized. So I certainly think that there is that effect as well, but it is important for us to have an understanding and appreciation for what youth are experiencing in our country. Thank you for that question.
Okay, now, so we have quite a few questions between the chat and YouTube. So just let us know when you need to get going, if it's running over for you.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got one from Kyle, and he says, thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering about the impact of these reflections throughout life. I'd be interested in hearing if you expect these perceptions to change, or to creatively reframe, is this something that youth may age out of?
That's a great question. This is also why some scholars are arguing that it's important for us to have an understanding as to youth perceptions, because many studies tend to focus on adult populations. And I can't answer that. I'm not sure if, youth will age out of these perceptions. But what I might say when it comes particularly for racialized people in this country, I don't think those perceptions will change. And I say this because the experiences of racial discrimination are not only within policing. The experiences are within education, within our healthcare system, within opportunities to get gainful employment. It also has an impact even on getting access to housing. Renting while Black is the problem. So these are things that have a significant impact. The idea of racial discrimination has a significant impact on the racialized person. So these all add up together and in essence then has a significant impact on perceptions of society on a whole. So I would think specifically for Black and Indigenous peoples in this country, feelings of perceptions of racial injustice are not something that you will age out of, as it is an experience as a racialized person, as one navigates the society.
Okay, great answer. All right, a question from Caroline. Thank you for the great talk. Do you have a sense as to whether or not certain types of victimization are more or less likely to lead to a call to police? And a second question, do you have a sense of the proportion of youth that experienced violence at the hands of police?
That is a great question. I unfortunately would not be able to answer that, and feel that some of my colleagues might be better suited to answer that. But from what some of the research is demonstrating, and from your own colleagues, is that a lot of police violence is concentrated within these racialized communities. And it is very important to explore their experiences. Again, many people tend to think that this does not happen in Canada and that how this is just not possible, but it's happening here. So it is important for us to have a better understanding of the experiences of those who reside in areas that are concentrated in poverty and unfortunately that also have racialized peoples as well. So it is an issue that needs to be discussed further. In terms of my own sample, how many experienced police violence, I would say that it was quite surprising to hear how many did. One is too many. So it was quite unfortunate to hear those that did experience police violence, and it also doesn't justify, this idea perhaps that, you're looking at a set of youth that is engaged in the criminal justice system. That doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter if they're caught for assault or whatever it may be. That does not necessitate physical violence. So it is a problem that should be discussed further, especially from the Canadian experience.
Okay, perfect. All right, a question here from William. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. I am curious, did participants have similar perceptions of other criminal justice actors, or were these perceptions limited to frontline police officers?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for that. So it was just limited to policing, but I will say that I had a few youth who expressed that they had, I would ask both about positive and negative perceptions of the police. And I had a few officers who expressed positive perceptions of police who were within their schools. So they felt that their officer who was in their school, they could, talk to, or was nice, or, was just there, but they were okay. But that did not negate the experiences, then the negative experiences they had outside of the school institution. So in essence, the argument that can be made there is that even though, there are positive experiences within the school, the minute that there's a negative experience outside of those walls, that completely negates any positive relationships that have been established within the school. Which again then demonstrates that the training that certain officers are getting in order to increase community engagement really needs to be something that is adopted by all and not just a few.
Okay, perfect. I think we've got about 4 more questions, and I see your hand up, Prof. Collins. Okay, but I've got a question here first from Ashley, who's been waiting for an answer for a little while. And she says, hello, Dr. Samuels-Wortley. Thank you so much for the great talk. I'm curious, as you mentioned, your sample came from shelters. If so, would your study be a better representation of how Black and Indigenous youth without stable housing experience or perceive police?
I think that's a great question. Thank you so much. So the reason I approached a youth shelter was because I specifically wanted to get insight into youth who have had contact with police. And this also was reflective of my white sample as well. I didn't want to get a sample of youth who, are in middle-class neighborhoods and perhaps may have nothing but positive things to say about the police. I wanted to see if youth who reside, who are residing within the youth home would have different perceptions of police. And I will be writing about this later, but there were still stark differences. So even white youth who had contact with police because of the situation of living, not having stable housing, still had more positive perceptions of the police than Black youth. A lot of the white youth felt that the police cared about them and, wanted to make sure that they would, get to the home or find somewhere to stay, and felt that the youth were there to protect them. The police were there to protect them. So that, in essence, right there is a finding that even despite the experience of being in a home, there still is racial differences in regards to perceptions and experiences with the police. Thank you for the question.
Okay, perfect. All right, a question from Shelley. Do you see or predict any improvements with changes in recruiting practices of police organizations? For example, hiring more visible minorities?
It's a great question. So do I see any changes? I'm going to say I'm hopeful, but do I think that having more diversity within Policing, if that's going to change, I will say no, unless the culture of policing changes. So we know from studies that demonstrate that even when you do increase the diversity within policing institutions, that still has not reflected in the way that racialized communities perceive police. So I think this addresses then what is the culture of policing and how does that have an impact on the way that somebody engages with individuals in the community. I can't speak to policing culture at the moment. I have great colleagues who would certainly be able to speak to that further. But I at this moment, I would say that increasing diversity is not going to have an impact because we've tried and that has still changed nothing. So it's important for us to dig deep and to go deeper into the culture of policing and how that is having a significant impact on the way that police engage with the community.
Okay, awesome. I think we got 2 more questions here.
Yeah.
So from Mitra, who says, such important research. Thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering if you could say more about the link or potential link between these perceptions and the unwillingness to report violence to police and an increase in violence or a decrease in community safety.
Sorry, do you mind asking that one more time?
No problem. Yeah. So they said, I'm wondering if you could say more about the link or the potential link between these perceptions and the unwillingness to report violence to police and an increase in violence and, a decrease in community safety.
Yes. So that's the idea of self-protection strategies or kind of turning to individuals within the community. So the connection that is being made there that is youth or who are known that they will not go to law enforcement officials because there's a sense that they won't be protected. They may experience more vulnerability because there is a sense and a knowing that this individual will not seek help outside of the community. And this also can, this in a sense of vigilante justice, this can have an impact on then how are issues being dealt with in communities. If so, now, is there an increase in violence potentially if there is no motivation to contact, individuals who are meant to protect people within these communities. So that's in essence where I'm trying to make the connection that if an individual does not feel that the state-sanctioned institution that is meant to serve and protect them will serve and protect them, then there will be alternative measures sought, which can also increase violence and lessen community safety within those areas.
All right, perfect. And Prof. Collins, you've been so patient. You're up, and then this will be our last question for Dr. Samuels-Wortley.
Dr. Samuels-Wortley, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I just have a quick question around sort of the ethnic composition of your Black sample. Like as you know, this is something that we deal with all the time. Black people are not a monolith. Diverse, we differ by ethnic group, by nationality, and we differ in our immigration histories, right? The experiences of Somalis, the Somali population who come here as refugees are vastly different to Nigerians who are mostly economic immigrants. And this all plays a part in also how our communities are racialized, right? So I'm just thinking about, whether you noticed any patterns along those lines in your data.
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I did ask youth their ethnicity. So where it was that either if they were born in Canada, how they identify with their ethnic background. And I would say that I would have most were born in Canada, but identified with an ethnicity in African areas, in the African continent. So And that's an excellent question that, you know, Black peoples are not a monolith. And then how does this have an impact? But I think then what I can say is that it doesn't matter in the eyes of the officer. They're all Black. So it didn't matter if they were from, you know, it was a good boy that is, you know, going to school and doing his thing. And I had that. I had a lot of kids who, especially in the after school program, who were not engaging in crime, but there is that perception because they have Black skin that they are. And one of the most striking responses that I had from one of the youth is that being stopped by police and experiencing racial profiling is just something you have to live with. And, you know, how sad is that coming from a young boy who is simply doing what he, you know, was meant to, just being a young boy walking, going to school, doing his thing, hanging out with his friends. But he knows that because of the color of his skin, he is going to be, he has an increased risk of being subjected to police attention. So I think that's a great question, and we should explore further about immigration status, but simply in the eyes of the institution, it doesn't matter.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
It does.
Thank you for that question.
All right, so I just want to say thanks again, Dr. Samuels-Wortley, for a great presentation. It was awesome. And to everyone who asked questions in the Q&A, they were awesome questions, and I think really kind of enriched the discussion. So, you know, we're going to leave it there. And just to mention, our next kind of speaker series will again be on the last Friday of October, on the 29th of October. This time it'll be Alistair Fraser from University of Glasgow, and he will be giving a yet untitled talk on kind of violence reduction in a public health framework. So the only difference with that talk, you know, still be the last Friday of the month. However, because you know, Dr. Fraser is in Glasgow, we're moving the talk to 10 a.m. Mountain Time so that you know, he can still put his kids to bed at a reasonable hour. So yeah, I hope you'll join us all for that. You know, keep an eye on our Twitter and our Instagram for the announcements. We'll have, you know, posters coming out a few weeks before and giving you all the details again. So with that, let's I'll shut off the live stream and